topic for the discussion today is digital as a game changer in real estate. This is me, I'll be your host. At Schneider, typically when we talk about real estate, we mention just maybe a couple of figures just to give us an idea of the topic today. So real estate is a big market for Schneider. It's about 40% of where we do our business globally. About, I would say, 60% of our portfolio ends up in a built environment. And we see a lot of trends in the industry which are catalyzing change. I'm not going to talk about all of them. This is typically what we'd have a conversation around when we're talking about how to handle change in the industry, but digital is the big one today, so we're just going to focus in on that. What do we do at Schneider in the real estate sector? So we have a kind of a motto. We help our global property customers achieve best-in-class financial performance by leveraging digitization, security, and sustainability. There are three topics, and today we'll be very much diving into digital. So why are we talking about digital? So let's talk about real estate for a second. So real estate, if we take some US figures, all right, real estate in the US, 13% of GDP. It is the largest asset class. It's the largest lending category. But it's a very, very, not a very technologized industry. Okay, so it typically, they spend about 0.5 of 1% on technology in real estate. Okay, which places it behind the fisheries industry, according to some studies, right? So not exactly setting the bar very high.
Ladies and gentlemen,
hang your head in shame, some of you property people that are looking at it. But the news is that this is very much changing, right? So change is afoot within the sector. Why do I say change is coming? A couple of reasons. So first of all, I read research that says, a recent survey says that 53% of commercial real estate companies have invested in technology companies, at least one. Okay, so that probably would not have happened 10, 15 years ago, so that's new. Another thing is that we're seeing property trade shows awash with prop tech companies. I was at Realcomm in June in Nashville, and I heard the property developer Related, who's behind the Hudson Yards development, the $25 billion development in New York, talking about the difficulty that they have in just navigating the landscape of prop tech companies. 3,000 calls every 3 months to come and see their latest products. So it's a very dense technology space in real estate now. And the other thing is that digital is beginning to be felt, I would say it's beginning to have an impact on asset valuation. So there's a 2016 study, which I can share with anyone that's interested afterwards, funded by the EU and carried out by the Wuppertal Institute in Germany, Cambridge Macroeconomics. And this study says that smart, connected commercial buildings typically command rents that are 11.8% up to 11.8% higher, and typically transact for anything up to 35% more than their standard equivalent. So you can imagine in an industry where mere basis point variance is of interest, this is an arresting figure by any standard. So that's pretty much the topic for today. It is, what is this new digital landscape that we are seeing in real estate, and how can we as ecosystem players navigate this new landscape? So it's an expert learning session. We have 3 experts to speak to us about this, and we're delighted to welcome them. So I'm going to introduce them one by one. Before I do that, just to tell you how this will play out, I have some questions which I've forgotten, but I'll probably remember. I'm going to ask them some questions just to get them warmed up, and there will be a lady or a gentleman, somebody will be walking around with a microphone during the session, and you can ask your questions to the panel. Okay, and then we'll have a short sum up at the end, and we should be finished by the top of the hour. Okay, nod some heads to show me that I see nodding heads. Wonderful. Okay. So introductions time. So on my far left, we have Mr. Francisco Acoba. So Francisco has joined us from Deloitte. Francisco is a senior real estate consultant in the North America business in Deloitte. In that capacity, talks mainly to corporate occupiers about their digital strategy and workplace, and also to some real estate players. We have a long-standing relationship with Deloitte at Schneider, so we're a client of Deloitte's, but we also supply technologies to them in some of their smartest buildings, notably the Edge in Amsterdam and the Majunga Tower in Paris. So, yes, old friends, let's say. So, welcome to Francisco. Next, we have Susan in the middle, Susan Clarke. So, Susan has joined us from Verdantix. Susan is a principal analyst, an expert, a research analyst in smart workplace technologies and software. She's published, you can read her stuff on the internet, very interesting, a fountain of knowledge. So we're delighted to have Susan here, all the way from that island that wants to leave the European Union. Sorry. And lastly, we have Mr. Kevin Cardona. Kevin is the Chief Innovation Officer with BNP Real Estate. So BNP, large property developer, subsidiary of BNP Paribas Bank. Also large service provider in the real estate space, big broker, one of the largest property managers in the 40 geographies that they operate in. So Kevin joins us from France. So if you can put your hands together to welcome our panel. Thank you. Okay. So we're going to get started. I'm just looking through these things, we don't need them. First question is to Francisco. So I'll find my phone. So Francisco, your daily work puts you in touch with some of the largest corporates on the planet, right? And the topics that you touch on, very much around workplace strategy. We have seen big moves in digital in this space. Could you describe to us what the most significant development in digital is for corporate occupiers at the moment?
Sure. So I guess the first thing I would highlight is that organizations and corporate occupiers have been looking at workplace strategies for the better part of the last decade or more, right? So most have implemented some level of workplace strategy, some mobility strategy, flex work, whatever it might be. But in the last, I would say, 2-3 years, the shift towards the technology aspects of the workplace strategy have, for all intents and purposes, exploded, right? So typically you have 3 legs to the stool when you talk about workplace. You have the space or the physical aspect of it. You have the HR aspect, and you have the IT aspect. So we always refer to that as the 3 legs of the workplace stool. Right now, the tech component of that is the primary focus, and has led to the development of entire new areas within corporate occupier organizations around digital workplace strategies and also around smart buildings. So the first, I might maybe highlight a couple of key things that we're seeing. One is the organizations are evolving to now include a digital workplace lead in many cases. So somebody who sits at the intersection of real estate and technology. So they have to understand both domains very well to be able to interlink and integrate the activities for the digital workplace. The second big thing that we're seeing is a change in the work. So if you think from a future of work perspective and how work is changing at many organizations, even just take the concept of RPA, or robotic process automation. Automation is changing the nature of the work landscape at many companies, right? Things that were always done internally, in-house, within administrative functions, in many cases now are being done by bots, and in many cases overseas, not even in the U.S. So a lot of those jobs, activities that were typically static organizational roles that sat in the office at a headquarters are no longer there, right? They're gone. So it's also changing the nature of how workspace is being used. The third thing that I would highlight is just around the level of and types of technology. So you mentioned 3,000 calls to related in a month or a quarter, whatever it was, around new technologies. Corporate occupiers are seeing the same thing. They're getting inundated with calls and inquiries from organizations to demonstrate their latest digital workplace or smart building technology. So what we're seeing in a lot of cases is that we're being brought in to help organizations just figure out what the landscape is and what they should be looking at, what they don't need to bother with, what should they focus on, where should they invest, because they clearly can't invest in the entire landscape at once. It's going to be overwhelming.
Very good. Okay. Susan? So, three-legged workplace bots, three-legged workplace strategies and overseas bots. How do you see, so what Francisco said in terms of developments, how do you see that affecting the space that you're specialized in? So the technology landscape, let's say for service providers, and what's the biggest impact that will have, the biggest knock-on effect?
Absolutely. So actually, the real estate ecosystem has a huge services landscape. If we look across the full value chain, there are firms involved in designing buildings, there are firms involved in constructing and developing buildings, and then there's also a whole ecosystem of firms involved in maintaining and managing buildings. So if we think about the services landscape for real estate, it is huge. Cormac mentioned earlier kind of in his introduction that often construction alone can account for about 10 to 15% of a country's GDP. And at Verdantix, we actually see kind of opportunity for the whole ecosystem from the kind of digital landscape and the changes there. Specifically at Verdantix, we have been analysing the opportunity of technology within the facilities services market. So when I talk about facilities services firms, I'm speaking there about the outsourced providers that maintain and manage buildings on behalf of owners and occupiers. And this is a part of the market which we see really ripe for a digital transformation right now. Those of you in the sector will know that digitalization has to date been extremely slow and painful in this sector. If you are involved in the facility services market, you will know that many of these firms are running businesses to very tight margins. Many facility services firms are taking on contracts with a 3 to 5% margin. So that has really kind of impeded the whole sector in making substantive investments into technology to date. So this is kind of why we haven't seen much activity to date. Another challenge for the facilities services firms is that it's really around the way that contracts are being structured. Many facilities services firms are continuing to price their contracts around labour. So by default, kind of they're not necessarily incentivized to invest in technology and automation. There's been a bit of an incentive there to kind of people load facilities contracts. So those have been some of the key challenges in the sector to date. The reason why people today are more optimistic and what is changing today is what we've seen is many of the large facility services firms are actually acknowledging that their business model is now at an impasse. Many of them are squeezed so tightly on their margin, and we've also seen the kind of demise of some of the very big providers in the market. So today we're seeing facility services firms review their business model more broadly and really look at the opportunity that technology can bring in terms of making their business more efficient. And I'd like to kind of, so that's the kind of broad context. I'd like to kind of highlight to you kind of two really promising technologies that we're seeing in the facility services sector and how they're delivering value. So the first kind of really interesting and high potential technology within facility services is around remote monitoring. So this is actually a fairly mature technology, and we've seen it used in energy management for nearly a decade. But what we're seeing is some of the larger facility services firms look at how they can use remote management technology to remotely monitor assets in buildings and even run remote fixes. And what we've seen through case studies in the market is it's possible for up to facility services firms to fix up to 70% of faults remotely without sending an engineer to site. So that's a clear efficiency there. And just a further related technology to highlight, it's all around mobile apps aimed at field workers. And we're seeing this kind of technology offer a lot more efficiency in the market. It's about reducing the paper trail and helping engineers to immediately digitalize any of their observations about a building and get that data immediately fed back to the help desk. So really speeding up communication across the different actors. So there's a lot happening, but certainly what we've seen in our research is the facilities and management services sector is very much ripe and ready for a digital transformation.
Okay, thanks very much, Susan. That's very interesting. Kevin, I'll flip over to you. So, Kevin, you are unique in this panel in that you're part of a property development business. So you're at the beginning of this whole cycle. So based on Francisco, what he said about corporate occupier expectations around digital, and also what Susan described as the changes in the way service providers are mutating their business model, what's the knock-on, let's say, the biggest knock-on effect for you as a developer, but also as a property management firm?
Well, basically, I was very interested by what you guys just said, because it's exactly my point in my day-to-day job, is to say that historically our business was about the building, the asset itself. And when you start to look at what's happening inside the building, in fact, the asset changes. And you have to make modifications to this asset to make sure that the complexity and the challenges of the occupier, maybe the end user, is dealt with. And I just want to share with you my understanding of this industrial revolution or digital revolution, saying that basically those little things, made us nomad connected individuals. And because of that, we can work from anywhere. And in fact, it's totally obsolete to still call those buildings office buildings, because you can work in Starbucks and right there on the stairs, So for me, the office of tomorrow is of course not anymore just your desk in one building in your headquarters. The office of tomorrow is of course still the HQ, and I strongly believe in those buildings tomorrow to be a lot more iconic, a lot more connected. But of course, as you produce value wherever you are now, the issue is how your HQ is connecting to your ecosystem. So to say it a fancy way, I think the issue is to invent for companies, for productivity, for attracting, retaining talents, a way to connect to your ecosystem with smart systems. And I think that's the challenge, basically, to embark in our product a system sufficiently smart to be able to connect to the end user wherever he is, because he became nomad and connected. So that's basically the challenge. And in that equation, your home becomes your office again. The train, for anyone who has been working on a train knows that it's one of the best offices in the world, and basically the co-working next door.
Depends where the train is, but
depending of the train, of course. But that's the issue. That's the issue of nomadism, and the fact that we do not work anymore just at the office on our desk doesn't mean anything anymore. So this vision of work is totally obsolete, and the whole industry has to adapt to that. Has to adapt to the fact that companies are mobile, has to be productive anywhere they are, and in this ability to connect to a large ecosystem. You cannot, even when you're called BNP Paribas or Schneider, you cannot win on your own. This world is over. So the world of tomorrow is our ability as big companies and other small companies to connect, and to connect to startups that will deliver a great service that does not exist yet. So our issue is to invent a product sufficiently open, sufficiently smart, to be able to welcome this ongoing digitalization of the world and ongoing service. The image I always use is to say that most of our buildings are BlackBerries. We need to invent iPhone buildings, because when you had an iPhone in your hand for the first time, you just had 3 apps in it. But Apple didn't wait to do that. didn't wait to invent WhatsApp or Instagram to actually invent that. So our challenge is to invent an iPhone building,
The building.
able to connect to the
the
best apps of tomorrow, and those apps will not all be from Schneider or BNP.
Okay,
But that's okay, you know.
Quick show of hands. How many people want to move into a BNP Paribas building? I see. Okay, thank you.
2,
Some people are still
3.
awake. Yeah, very good.
Okay, we'll talk after.
Plug.
So,
Unashamed plug.
Cormac, actually just to build on Kevin's comment there. So it's interesting 'cause what we've seen in the last year or so, as and traditionally we've been working with corporate occupiers, but we've been getting pulled into discussions with a lot of owner occupiers, real estate developers in the last year. Now, as they're looking at the marketplace and they're seeing that, corporates are deploying strategies to reduce their footprint. They're not taking on as much new space as they did 5 or 10 years ago. They're being smarter about it. They're taking less space, but it's smart space. It's more intelligent, more well-designed space. They're trying to figure out, the developers and the owners trying to figure out, how do we best attract the AAA high-quality credit tenants that we want? What can we do to differentiate ourselves in the marketplace? And from the perspective of digital, what technologies do we need to deploy in the building or in the campus from an infrastructure perspective to attract those tenants? So what will the developer put in place versus what will the corporate occupier put in place? And that balance goes back and forth, and you see lots of examples in the marketplace of maybe over dialing one way or the other. So people are still trying to figure it out. But I think that's certainly one of the big questions in the marketplace right now.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Both points very interesting. I'm just thinking back to your building, and something that it made me think of was when we talk about digital, we're talking about data, we're talking about the value of data, but we automatically think of disruption and disruptive business models. Anybody here have shares in Blockbuster Video or Kodak? No. Okay, but you know where I'm getting at, right? So, question for Susan is, where do you see the likeliest and biggest disruption coming from this digital wave?
Sure. So as a technology analyst, people are always asking me kind of, where's the next innovation? Where's the next disruption? And sometimes it's useful to think about what we mean by disruption. So borrowing from Christensen, I like to think about disruption as sometimes an innovation that comes from the bottom of the market. And it's something that is initially useful to a few sub-segments, but eventually it breaks across the chasm and it starts impacting the mass market. And what history has shown us that it can be very difficult to predict and foresee disruptions. So it certainly is a challenging question, but I'd like to propose a few likely candidates within the real estate ecosystem. So I've already spoken a bit about facilities services firms, but we really do see that as a good candidate for disruption. Many of these firms are running businesses where 70% of their revenue goes on to staff costs. So it's still a very labour-intensive sector, and there's still an opportunity for a lot of quick wins and efficiency there. Secondly, I'd also like to highlight the construction sector. So this is a part of the market that Verdantix has been exploring in our research recently. And again, it's another kind of market sector where there are some kind of clear inefficiencies there. It's not unheard of for development to go over budget by 80%. It's not unheard of for development timelines to extend by 20%. And we also hear about instances in which 20% of the work on construction sites ends up being knocked down because there are structural clashes that were not foreseen within the design and kind of engineering consulting phase. And all of that, to me, screams there is an opportunity here for disruption. It doesn't mean it will be easy, but certainly we've seen some of the early signs that this is possible in the market with all of the funding going into Contech, so construction tech, recently. And that totaled around 6 billion last year. So that there's lots of kind of areas which are ripe for disruption in the real estate sector, but for Verdantix, kind of what's kind of really become clear to us recently is it's the facilities services firms and also the construction sector which are the most likely candidates.
Can I answer also?
Kevin, you asked so politely you will.
I have
scrabbling desperately for the next question, so you're saving my life.
Sorry, maybe I answer for the next question already, but I think because I'm seeing that graph in front of me, and I think that's really key. You know, one of the reasons we talk together with Schneider for a long time now, but is really this question, because in my day-to-day job I meet, of course, a lot of prop techs, so a lot of candidates of disruption, but all of them are making the same mistake. They think real estate is a scalable industry, as any other whatever tech. You know, whatever tech is, you deploy an algorithm on a huge market that works really well on internet. The problem is that every building is different, so it doesn't work, so it doesn't scale. So you can have something great for one asset, but to be able to actually scale it on hundreds of assets, good luck. So what we need, what those prop techs need, typically, and that's the discussions we're having with Schneider. The reason I'm here, it's really because I'm a very big defender of this, basically. Because we need infrastructure to let those guys enter the market. And that's also my responsibility as a subsidiary of a bank, because we want new players in the game, and we want to help them grow, you know, and access to this old market, which is real estate. And one way to access is to have this backbone of data connection. And when you talk about APIs to real estate guys, well, half of them don't even understand what you're talking about. So really the issue is to be able to have the fourth fluid of real estate. We had water, electricity, and air. And now we need data. And this data is going through tubes called IP tubes. And we need that in all buildings for those prop techs to be able to scale. Otherwise, there will never be any disruption in the real estate sector.
Okay, yeah, that's very, 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 very interesting. This thought of openness and how we interact and navigate with these with new entrants into the market. Excellent. So next question, just to Francisco, we're jumping slightly off here. You talked a little bit about digital workplace. To be quite honest, full transparency. If I think of digital workplace, I think, okay, mobile application, HoloLens, swiping, moving blinds, turning off lights. Help me out here. Is that what a digital workplace means? What does it mean for the vast majority of the corporates you're talking about? And what's the top priority in establishing the digital workplace?
Sure. So those could be components of the digital workplace, but I think that, you know, historically, you think about smart buildings and digital in real estate. The big thing was energy management, energy efficiency, reducing energy costs, you know, replacing your lighting units and so forth. And all of that is, I would say now, it's expected, and it's almost it's foundational, right? So corporate occupiers are expecting that the efficiencies from an energy perspective and all the things that Schneider does, etc. That's like, you know, table stakes, right?
It's like air conditioning in your car. It used to be great, and now
it just needs to be there, right?
Yeah.
So now, you know, you go to this. So what's next? And that's where you get into things like, you know, more effective management today, I would say, of occupancy, right? So deploying IoT and sensorization in the building and tying that into the infrastructure to be able to maximize the actual use of space, right? So this goes back to the building less space, right? But in the end, it's going to be, you know, more effective space for the occupiers. And that, again, that does need a infrastructure backbone and some level of foundational infrastructure that's required to do that they can plug into. The second item that maybe I would highlight there is, so occupancy is one big thing. The other one is, more broadly, organizations today are looking at workplace experience. And from a culture and a talent perspective, driving an improved and enhanced workplace experience is critical for anybody in the Fortune 500 to be able to recruit and retain the right talent. In order to be able to do that, that's where you begin to look at other digital opportunities. So, whether you look at mobile apps to reduce friction in the workplace, smart lighting, smart parking, visitor experience, all the things that can enhance the value of the, again, workplace experience for an organization are being looked at very critically by companies and trying to see where do they invest in these areas to provide a better workplace for their occupants.
Fantastic. So we've talked. I was going to open it up to questions, but Kevin, you can.
Just because I fully agree with what he said, and I want to give figures on that, because it's actually the history of my career. I started as an architect engineer doing energy reduction, and went up the ladder, ending up doing marketing and storytelling, and explaining how building and office building will be such a great experience that you need to go to those buildings. But basically, you have to have in mind that the energy sector in real estate is around 45 euro per square meter out of the charges budget, and energy is 1/3 of this. So even if you have the best energy efficiency, you can reduce that by half. We're still only talking about 15% of 45 euros. So it's a couple euros. Where the rent is more likely to be close to 10 times more, so 500 to 800 euros. And that's why square meter is of course the new rarity in dense cities, where those big companies needs to be to attract the talents. So that's why every square meter has to be cherished and optimized the best way possible, because it's a 10 times more important issue in your P&L than energy. And the last one is of course retaining talents, which is even more than the rent, because the cost of your staff is 80% of your cost as a CEO. So your issue is actually to retain and attract the right talents and make sure they stay in your company. And that's hard to measure, but that's an enormous, of course, P&L issue.
Excellent. I have loads more questions, but we have 11 minutes left, so I would like to get some questions from you guys. Ooh, do we have a microphone? Please.
Hi.
So if you can say which company you're from, your name, where you're from.
I manage a company which do consultancy. We located in Israel, do projects all over the world. Basically, when we design smart building, we face a problem.
We can hear you fine.
You hear me? Okay, we face a problem with the customers keep asking how to take an old building and renovate it. And this is the main problem, as you mentioned before. And I took your words, as BNP would like to see more and more projects, but usually it goes to the new one. So how we can take those old buildings and renovate it in a reasonable investment and do what you are offering?
Thank you very much. So great question. Quick stat for you all. I read that in 2050, all of the buildings that will exist, 75% of those exist already. So brownfield, big thing. Who wants to take that? Let's you guys.
I can certainly start. So we deal with that question all the time, right? So it's and from a corporate perspective, do we go to a new location? Do we renovate our existing owned asset, right? So there is the big challenge is that when you talk about foundational infrastructure, retrofitting can be very expensive, right? So this is certainly, and especially in major cities, we still see the issue of the fact that a lot of the older stock in real estate has, the column spacing is not right for the new workplace, and there's challenges in really planning out an optimized environment in a structure that was built 100 years ago, right? So we see that all the time. Can it be done? Yes. I mean, we're seeing it in New York and other cities now where people are taking assets that literally were 80, 100 years old, but it's basically pretty much a gut renovation, right? You got to go down to concrete and steel and build it back up, at least for your space, to be able to put the right infrastructure in and the right technology. So there's no easy answer there. It's a business case, but what it comes down to in many cases is we're seeing, again, from a talent and a recruitment retention perspective and a positioning perspective, where do you want to be? So what's the right location, right? So it's an interesting business case. It's qualitative and quantitative.
And I would complete that in an answer around business modeling, because I strongly believe that the historical business model of office buildings are not enough to foresee the value of what we're talking here. So basically what we are thinking now is to first, of course, change the backbone of the building without actually having to change the concrete itself, but at least making the office a bit cooler and a bit more flex and a bit more efficient in terms of use per square meter. But typically the issue is to change the KPI first. It's not a question of how many people per square meter, it's a question of how many services per square meter, or services per people. And then the issue is also to use every square meter. So while doing this retrofit, it's not just about putting some smart infrastructure, it's also a way to look at every square meter of your asset. And I always take the same examples, like those big halls or those big restaurants which are used only 2 hours per day, which is totally heretic if the building is at the right place. So supposedly the square meter is rare and expensive. Then you can transform those places as co-working and make sure that you create, in fact, a buffer for your company. So those square meters which yesterday were in the charge part of your P&L, they become in the revenue part of your P&L. So it's a new way to see the office building basically as a revenue generating asset with a lifespan which is a lot more. Because in the old business model, basically your office building were used 30% of the time, if I count night and weekends. But if you start to do a public accessible space in your building, in the ground floor, for example, then you start to open your office building at night and weekends, because as we said before, that we became nomad individual connected, you can work in any building. So it comes from the charge business model to a revenue business model with a lifespan of the efficiency of every square meter a lot bigger. So it's a new business model generating more revenues and more use for the end user.
And I'd just like to add on a kind of a complementary point there. Kind of one strategy we have seen corporate occupiers use is actually look at space utilization and space rationalization. So shrinking your real estate portfolio as one avenue for opening up funds to actually reinvest in the rest of your real estate. So if you have a real estate where there is some opportunity to flex some of that space, that could start opening up funds to create a better workplace for the rest of your real estate. And just to throw in a few stats there, we typically see in an average organization, 10% of desks are empty. And that's just because they haven't been allocated to a member of staff. So typically, most organizations, when you start looking into this further, do find there are some easy wins.
Excellent. It's going to be tight. We have time for a quick question. Sushil, if you want. We've got a mic for Sushil. Thanks, Sushil.
My question was going to be pretty long, but I'll probably now remove parts of my question. I'm Sushil. I run the corporate function for a company called JLL. After Susan spoke today, I'm going to prepare my CV and look for a job about sort of the margins. But you're right, and maybe during the break I can give you my perspective on that. But maybe a question for Deloitte. There's a rule of 330-300. You guys are very familiar with it. And I'm going after the 300. You guys spoke a lot about 3 utilities, 30 occupancy, and 300 is the seat cost, where people like you and I sit. And the experience of the employee, the productivity of the employee is going to be the holy grail for firms like us to succeed, rather than the 3 to 5 or 7% margins. Probably same for BNP. Have you seen anything? Have you seen any work being done on that productivity measurement, not the subjective part of it? I'm an expert on the subjective part of it. Just on the objective part of measurement. Yeah,
so clearly productivity always the holy grail for real estate, right? To figure out how are we improving or not improving productivity in the workplace. What we have seen is organizations that are, more certainly leading edge around their occupancy and strategies, looking at KPIs that are focused on workplace experience, as opposed to the traditional types of KPIs that were very in that 30 zone, right? So more focused on the cost. So looking at how are we impacting workplace experience, and how are we contributing to that? If we're improving the overall net promoter score that you get when you do your surveys, or so there's also some a workplace experience surveys that are out there in the marketplace that can become part of that KPI measurement. So if you're productively contributing to that aspect of it, that's where you can begin to elevate the discussion, right? But it certainly, I would say, it's not every real estate organization or even corporation that's ready to have that discussion yet, because it's a much more sophisticated and nuanced discussion.
Excellent, Francisco. Thank you, and thanks to Sheil for asking that question. We've 3 minutes left. We've time for a parting word. Susan, if you want to. Do you want to weigh in on the productivity question? Because I think I had actually, it's like you read my notes this year, because I was going to ask that. And I was like, what?
I guess just one thing, one point I'd like to raise is that we speak a lot about kind of buildings and their role in creating a productive workforce. But I think coming back to your question, there are still kind of unanswered questions in the market around the extent to which your building can really contribute to productivity. And as a business, kind of where should you be investing your money? Is it in creating a great building, or should you be looking at investing that in other staff initiatives and IT systems? So it's certainly kind of we've got some valuable kind of topics being brought to the table now, but there are still questions to ask, and businesses need to think about the extent to which their building contributes to productivity.
Fantastic. Okay. So I've got 2 minutes left, so I'm going to wrap it up very quickly. So I'm going to try and sum up what we've learned today. So, not easy, because I learned so much. Francisco, the three-legged stool of workplace with overseas bots and drive for productivity. I like the stuff about workplace analytics, about experience in buildings and how we underpin that. I think it's hugely important. Very, very interesting. Susan, you're a fountain of knowledge on the service provider space and what the challenges the companies are facing in that area. It's really, really interesting to understand. I think the necessity for change that is here, and that's interesting. When we talk about change, there's change might be a nice idea, but you're talking about the burning necessity that things have to change along the lines of what Cecile mentioned. I think is really good. And Kevin, as always, it's great listening to you talk, man. Really, really interesting listening to your ideas about the changing ways of work, something that Deloitte touched on in their white papers as well. The future of work being much more nomadic. I love your iBuilding idea. There's an idea. A building as a repository for all these applications that we can have. So one person said to me,
we call it the PropTech store.
The PropTech store. I love it. So we're going to finish on that. My parting words to you all. First of all, thank you all for coming and listening, because there's a big crowd. We couldn't even all get sitting down. So big thanks to you all for listening. Huge thanks to our guests. You can give them another round of applause, because they came from very far away. So it's been a pleasure. Quick call to action for you guys. The real estate aspect of this wonderful innovation summit is definitely not over. We have a commercial real estate booth over there with a wealth of knowledge to share with you all. We're running regular tours in English, in Espanol, so please come and see us, and we'll continue the conversation there. And link in with us, link in. Thanks everybody.